A day after outlining 13 criminal charges against Chinese tech giant Huawei and its affiliates, American officials are now revealing new details about just how much of a threat they think China is to the U.S. What concerns are they raising, and how could that affect Canada? The CBC's Katie Simpson is joining us with more on that. Hey, Katie, thanks for being here. So, U.S. national security leaders met in Washington today to discuss the threats facing America, China among them. How did China factor into the discussion?
Well, China and Huawei were both specifically called out by the top officials in the world of U.S. national security. And have a listen here. This is just a flavor of some of the conversations. It wasn't just China and Huawei they discussed today, but just listen to these concerns raised by these American lawmakers and security officials.
They have to decide they're either going to be a worldwide telecommunications company or an agent of the Chinese government. They can't be both.
The Chinese counterintelligence threat is more deep, more diverse, more vexing, more challenging, more comprehensive, and more concerning than any counterintelligence threat I can think of.
So those are top officials within the American world of national security, and clearly China is a concern. Canada has named China a concern as well, but it comes at a time when Canada has to make a very serious decision about whether it's going to allow Huawei to be a part of its developing 5G network. A 5G network will allow more information to move faster across Canadian cellular devices, and Canada has to make a decision. The Americans, the Australians, and the people of New Zealand have already decided to ban Huawei from this advancing technology over fears that China could use the company to spy. Canada has not made that decision yet. Today, the Public Safety Minister, Ralph Goodale, said it's still a ways off. He was asked, is it weeks or months? And it's beyond weeks in terms of when Canada is going to make that decision. The U.S. has pushed Canada to get on board with their concerns and to ban Huawei. But at this point, there is no decision from the Canadian government. Of course, any decision, if it were to come anytime soon, the Canada-China relationship is already in a very bad spot. China has threatened to retaliate against Canada if it does ban Huawei, Huawei being one of the country's proudest companies with connections to the highest reaches of power in Beijing. And so the Canadian government isn't making its decision just yet.
As you mentioned, the relationship is pretty fraught right now. Have there been any decisions, or what's the latest on what the government is saying about, for example, appointing a new ambassador to replace John McCallum, whom they fired over the weekend?
That decision has not been made yet. And what we're hearing from Chrystia Freeland is sort of the government is not ruling anything out in terms of how it is going to sort of, staff the embassy in Beijing, how they're going to throw resources at this issue. And have a listen to what Chrystia Freeland told reporters earlier today.
Of course, it is important for Canada to have an ambassador in Beijing, and the government is working on that as well. I do want to underscore for Canadians, this is a significant choice, and it's a choice that needs to and will be made carefully.
So a number of academics had been recommending that the government perhaps pick a special envoy to go over to China and deal just directly with this issue. I'm told by a senior source that nothing has sort of been ruled out at this point, and so that's one option they're looking at, but there's no sort of frantic list of names of people that they're trying to sort of track down and say, hey, will you go and do this for us? In the next couple of weeks, we know that the Canadian government is supposed to have scheduled consular visits with both Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor, the two detained Canadians being held by Chinese authorities.
All right, thank you so much for the update, Katie. The CBC's Katie Simpson. Robert Williams is Executive Director of the Paul Tsai China Center at Yale Law School. He joins me now from New Haven, Connecticut. Hi, Mr. Williams. Great to see you. Thank you for your time.
Thanks for having me.
How should we interpret the two indictments that were unsealed yesterday? What do they tell us about Huawei, and what do they not tell us?
Well, what they do not tell us is related to the broader background concerns that the United States has about Huawei as a potential national security threat. And that's a concern that is longstanding and has more to do with the role of the Chinese government and its relationship with the company, and a concern that Huawei cannot truly be independent from the Chinese government. The indictments that were unveiled yesterday deal specifically with alleged offenses related to sanctions violations and theft of intellectual property from a U.S. business partner, which is corporate malfeasance to be sure, but is not something that should be conflated with that broader national security concern.
Do you think that that the two will be conflated? I mean, given that the scrutiny over the national security side of this has been so high as of late, do you think, sort of outside of experts, that it will be conflated? And what might the detrimental effects of that be?
Sure. I think perceptions are naturally going to lead in that direction. And it's certainly the case that some of the broader concerns around Huawei and other Chinese entities, to be fair, have informed the Justice Department's decision to prioritize its so-called China Initiative, which is directed at a range of what the Justice Department sees as misbehavior and illegal activity on the part of Chinese individuals and entities in the United States. So prioritizing law enforcement resources is one thing, and then bringing these specific charges on these specific allegations is another. But as you say, perceptions are going to be what they are.
And just on that, China, of course, has been steadfast in its opinion, or the Chinese government, that the legal case against Huawei's CFO, Meng Wanzhou, is political in nature. Does yesterday's announcement change anything with that? Does it reinforce it? Does it pour cold water on it?
I'm sure for the Chinese leadership, it's going to confirm and reinforce that sense. However, I would just reinforce that if we look at the specifics of what is alleged here, we are talking about some fairly systematic and egregious behavior. Now, of course, none of this has been proven, but if we just go by the indictments themselves, I think there's very little question that this is a legitimate law enforcement action, just looking at the letter of the law.
And can I ask you to expand on that a little bit? What gives you, I mean, I know, for example, that the allegations date back a number of years, that they're about stealing sort of intellectual property, allegedly, as well as violating sanctions against Iran, lying to banks, that kind of thing. What makes you, on the face of it, understand that this is not necessarily political in nature?
Well, in order to bring a charge like this, a grand jury has to reach a finding, and that is based on some evidence. So they have to present, prosecutors have to present a certain amount of evidence just to bring charges like this. That does not mean that these allegations are proven by any means. It does not mean that there won't be additional evidence that may contravene certain aspects of what the Justice Department has presented. We simply don't yet know enough detail to make an informed judgment about this, and that will be left to the justice system, as it well should be.
Is it possible, Mr. Williams, to view these proceedings, these criminal proceedings, as separate from the overall trade tensions between the two countries, or are they linked in some way?
Well, we have to remember, stepping back and looking at these indictments in context, that these criminal investigations began long before the current round of trade negotiations. So I don't think that we can look at the indictments as being linked to the trade tensions in a kind of transactional manner that some might be inclined to see them in. On the contrary, again, these may reflect longstanding concerns on the part of the Justice Department and law enforcement authorities, but I would be very reluctant to suggest that they are directly tied to the current trade negotiations. That's simply not the way the U.S. Justice Department tends to work. And
I know that you of course, explained how it's separate from the national security concerns, but it's happening against the backdrop, I guess, of those concerns being discussed, especially here in Canada. This country is reviewing Huawei's participation in our 5G network. If the West sort of en masse does freeze Huawei out of this emerging market, how do you think China will respond?
It's difficult to say. China's ambassador to Canada, for example, I understand has invoked self-defense, in referring to some of the actions that have already been taken in the context of the arrest of Huawei's chief financial officer. So it's certainly the case that we can assume some action will be taken, some effort to advance the country's interests, but it's very difficult to speculate about what that will look like, how far it will go, and how much of the current, you referred earlier to the trade negotiations, how many of the current issues that are on the table there, which involve structural issues relating to the role of the Chinese government and the Chinese economy, how many of those issues will be affected and informed by this perception on the part of the Chinese leadership that there's a broad-based effort to thwart the interests of China and Chinese companies. It's very difficult to say, and I think we're likely headed for a rocky period.
Okay, I'll leave it there. Thank you very much for your time and insight, Mr. Williams.
Thank you for having me.
U.S. law enforcement and intelligence officials reiterated today their concerns that Huawei 5G network equipment could be used to spy by the Chinese government. CBC News asked Huawei Canada about those concerns. Here's what the company had to say. Huawei Canada is committed, a spokesperson writes, to doing what is required to meet Canadian security standards for 5G networks. With respect to Chinese lawful access legislation, we work for our Canadian customers and partners only. Simply put, we comply only with Canadian laws. We cannot and would not ever allow access to the networks we support. As we mentioned earlier, the Canadian government's review of the 5G network is currently ongoing, but there were many opinions about that review and what the outcome should be on Parliament Hill this afternoon.
I think this is a very serious issue, and this government needs to take it seriously, and I think that absolutely we need to ban Huawei. It's what our allies have done, and we're the ones who are currently offside because we're the ones who haven't.
Would you ban Huawei 5G in Canada?
Yes, I will listen to our allies that are asking us to do that, and yes, for the security of our country, telecommunication is too important. Yes, the government must do it.
We're a sovereign country, and we're going to make sure that we do what's in our interest by looking at the information accordingly. Yes, we engage our allies. Yes, we work with our Five Eyes countries to make sure we see what they're doing, but ultimately we're going to make a decision in our own domestic interest.
The process is underway, and I'm not going to answer as to when that will be completed. It'll be completed after we have, to our own satisfaction, looked at it in detail.
This is a serious decision, and we will make it in a serious and conscientious way so that Canadians are properly benefited by the result and properly protected. National security will not be compromised.